started life as a materials engineer, working with composite materials, and over the time have moved more towards system design methods, and we'll be talking about some of those second part of this presentation this afternoon. And Michael will take us through some of the challenges that we're facing and some of the aspects of how we're looking in the UK to solve some of the challenges bringing sustainable energy to play here in the UK. I won't spend too long on that, but Mike's got a much longer history in energy systems, working originally as a combustion engineer for E.ON, and then more recently he's the stakeholder manager at the ETI. And I'll pass over to Mike in a second. So, as I say, the long title, Planning Sustainable Energy Systems Transition Using Soft Systems and ISO 16355. Hopefully by the end of the talk we'll have a bit more of a handle on what that means. The primary focus is to say how do we link high-end policy type statements and how do we make those more coherent for people doing system development further down the chain, but also how do we then tie that into business solution development, which is a critical part of this kind of transition. So the presentation will kick off with Mike talking about Sustainable Energy Systems Challenge. He'll then look at work that's being done at the Energy Technologies Institute, particularly relevant to transition planning. I spent about 18 months working at the ETI several years ago on one of the programs, but also at that time was started working more closely with Mike in his role doing stakeholder management and starting to shape the way programs were put together. Okay, I will give a very, very short introduction to soft systems method. So I will try and explain what that means, and then look at the areas of policy deployment and QFD supporting soft systems method, and particularly the transition from soft systems into what might be described as hard technical systems. So that's the main focus of my part of the talk, and then we'll just obviously summarise. So on that point, I think we now do a fairly clunky handover onto slides. Yeah. Good, Matt. There we go. Do you want to
take the mic? Right. So, yes, good evening. So I'm Mike Colchin, Partnership Manager with the ETI. To fill in some extra details on Kim's description of me, I started my life on the railway. Well, I started my career as an engineer on the railway, and then did research work at Nottingham Uni on automotive engines, so automotive combustion. Moved into power station combustion, 10 years with E.ON before moving into an R&D management role there. Another 5 years of doing that before I joined the ETI. So I was actually managing E.ON's membership of the ETI during that sort of final period with E.ON before I moved across the fence, and I've spent the last 6 years with the ETI as their partnership manager. Right, get the right button here. There we go. So, what is a sort of the run-up to Kim's piece, I'm going to sort of run through just some of the challenges, some of the things that we've been doing in the ETI, looking at this whole issue of the energy system and where it's heading and why it needs to head there, and really sort of setting up some of the complexity and some of the ways that we've been trying to deal with that through the work we've been doing, which then I think Kim will take on and sort of describe sort of the theory that can underpin some of that sort of work. So you'll all have seen this before, this idea of the energy trilemma, this issue of how we ensure we've got a secure supply of energy, but we also make sure it's sustainable and affordable. And the way that this has been set up as a sort of energy policy for the UK still sits there as a centre of that energy policy as much as it exists, but actually has those three things in tension. Because of course, if you try and do something more sustainable, it has the potential to be more expensive, which hits your affordability issues. And by the way, you can't forget about the security supply thing as you go along as well. So that sort of sets some of the context. I think taking that context a bit further, just thinking about where the system is today and where it's heading. I struggle a little bit with this slide, even though I put it together, because what I'm using on this slide is some of the future predictions that come out of the predictions that the government use when they're looking at where to go with their policy. And they do this on the basis of linear predictions. So that, that first one, this idea that out to 2050, so this target date of 2050 for being when we want to have achieved an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, the predictions say that we will have a population of almost 80 million by then. Look back in history, you will never see a linear growth in population anywhere in our history, although it has increased over time. So it's very hard to say that that's actually what will happen. But a lot of the planning is done on the basis of that sort of linear projection. Likewise, vehicles. This whole idea that we'll be doubling the number of vehicles on the road, well, almost, at least adding 50% to the number of vehicles on the road by 2050. If you actually look at what's happening in London, the trend is going completely the other way. So some of these sort of traditional trends that have been used for predicting where things are heading, allowing people to do planning around big infrastructure projects, are actually starting to be challenged by the things that are actually happening on the ground, on the back of lots of work that's been done to try and change things that are happening on the ground. So it's sort of a, so what did you expect to happen sort of question, but nevertheless, we're still using these sort of predictions. I think one of the things I would hang my hat on is this idea of housing, and not so much necessarily the prediction in the number of houses we'll have, which is obviously very linked to the predictions in population, but this issue of 80% of the stock we have that will be there in 2050 has already been built. So this issue that if you're going to do anything about the energy use in buildings, you've got to think very seriously about how you refurbish and do something with the building stock we've got today. You can't just assume that you're going to build your way out of the problem by 2050, because you're not. The other piece in here is thinking about the supply side of the system and thinking about what we have currently, and this issue that we've got a lot of aging plant that needs to be replaced. There are new things coming onto the system in terms of renewables. There's potential for large amounts of CO2 storage. All of the things that could add to this solution around how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and creates significant opportunities in the UK. And the but is, it's not moving fast enough. We're not moving towards those solutions quickly enough to really hit some of the targets. Which sort of brings me on to why the ETI was set up. And we were set up 10 years ago as an organisation that would help to drive innovation. Now, at the time, as I said before, I was with E.ON, and in E.ON, E.ON is no longer a member, but they were in the beginning, and the issue we were dealing with then, and remember this is, 10 years ago, so it's 2007, it's before the crash. And at that point in time, we were seeing this need to build significant amounts of plant and real risks for us around that plant becoming stranded assets, either because we hadn't invested early enough in low carbon technology, or because we'd invested too early, because the costs of those low carbon technologies were very high at that time. So one of our drivers for getting involved in ETI is saying, look, we're not getting the solutions. We haven't got the solutions that we can deploy today. For goodness sake, drive things forward. This organisation was set up with 6 industry members at the time, all contributing, signing up to contribute 5 million per annum for 10 years. Government matched that, So the ETI had a budget of up to £60 million per annum to spend on this whole piece of driving innovation. A year later, crash happened, and all of those companies got affected by that crash, not until the middle of the life of the ETI, and consequently the expectation we had that these companies would be pulling through the solutions that ETI was driving at disappeared. So there's been a lot of CO2 saved over the last few years simply because there's been a lower demand for energy. So there's a whole political and economic background which has really stirred up what's happening in the energy sector, but leaves us with a legacy of a problem. And the legacy of the problem is we still haven't got on and delivered what's needed in terms of moving towards a low carbon energy system. And one of the things that we were challenged with as an organisation was to show our board, and you can imagine what our board's like with those, you know, they were set up as a fleet of foot, flexible, fast-moving, small organisation, but it's hard to be that when you've got a board full of very large companies and government. And one of the challenges they gave us was, prove to us, give us evidence for the decisions you're making about where you want to invest our money. And so we did a lot of work looking at energy system modelling. So developed quite a large and effective stochastic model of the energy system in the UK, which sits alongside things like times, but has this stochastic element and a sort of regional variation element to it. And we've done lots of work with that. I deliberately avoid ever saying ESME says, and I have heard my colleagues say it, because modelling doesn't give you the answer. It gives you a way of digging at the questions you need to be answering on the way through, but it isn't the answer in itself. However, this slide shows you some of the data that comes out of the analysis we've been doing with ESME, and I think here the issue isn't so much the size of any of these bars, but you can see here what we've done is stacked the generating capacity for electricity. Now, also to say that ESME looks at the whole system, not just electricity, but this is sort of quite an easy one to get your hands around, because you've got that sort of 2010, where were things? Well, it was more or less even split between gas, coal, nuclear, and a bit of renewables. Where might things head out to 2050? Where might things head? This isn't what the answer will be, but you could see, if you're aiming for the 80% CO2 target, you could see a mix that might be gas with CCS and nuclear and hydrogen and some renewables. I could show you plenty of other graphs that show all sorts of different options as well. The other thing in here, though, is to say, also use that same technique, modelling technique, and this is optimised, engineeringly perfect systems, so you've got to question where that is as well. But if you didn't have that 80% reduction target, what does the model tell you you might be doing? And actually it says you'd be generating a lot less electricity, because in theory everyone becomes more efficient, and therefore you don't need as much electricity for the same volume of the same needs at the bottom end. And because they're the lowest cost options, if you're not trying to hit these targets, you get coal and gas deployed by a model that's sort of free to do whatever it wants to do. And the really important bit about this is actually where the change starts happening. So coming back to this issue of, can we hit an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050? Absolutely, the answer we give to that is yes, we can. But we've got to get on with it, and we've got to be making some very serious decisions about where our infrastructure is heading by the mid-20s, and after that we've got to start building the new system. So given that we aren't ready to make any of these decisions today, that sets the challenge. We've got 10 years left to be ready to be really starting to deploy these solutions if we're going to hit these 2050 targets. So that's one part of the picture. another one is cost. And again, we've been using that modelling system that we've developed to look at potential costs. And I set this graph in the context of some of the other major costs within our economy. So you've got sort of MOD expenditure of around 40 billion per annum. The NHS costing us around 100 billion per annum. And the energy system today costing us around 120 billion. That's everything in the energy system. That's all the sort of primary energy inflows and the conversion that goes on. And you can see plotted on there also transport, high speed to schools in that mix. This graph shows the cost of delivering that 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions out to 2050. So you can see that by 2050 we're predicting, and again caution about that word predicting, suggesting that you'd be of the order of £35 billion per annum to do a low carbon system compared to a business as usual system. I think the thing to remember about that as well, though, is that there is a lot of investment needed in the energy system at the minute, and with the other growth factors that people put in, which is also built into this calculation, it assumes these linear growth in population and demand and what have you. Your energy system by then is likely to be costing you 300 billion per annum. So the huge increase in cost of the system overall. And key message in there that to do low carbon is actually only 10% more. It is going to cost you more than a non-low carbon system, but actually that volume of that cost is in the noise of the overall cost of the system, because you're not going to be able to make a 10% certainty prediction of that overall cost of the system. All we know is that it will cost more, given the challenge that we face of renewing infrastructure over the next few decades. So that takes us on to the other piece that we've been doing, which is looking at what options we have and what those different options might cost, and how you actually keep that cost of going low carbon as low as possible. And what this graph does is shows showing this is now the total cost of going low carbon out to 2050, shown on the left hand side there. So you've got this sort of perfect engineering solution as the first bar. You add on a bit of reality and say, well, yeah, it's probably going to cost you 100 billion pounds more to do the thing for real, but optimized system, you could do it for 300 billion pounds is the sort of ballpark figure that we've come up with through this analysis we've been doing, which is around 1% of 2050 GDP, which is a sort of figure that people have been talking about for some time now as being the target for delivering a low carbon energy system. Then we've started saying, well, okay, but that assumes you've got all options available to you. What happens if some of those options don't prove to be available? For instance, we don't get on or sort out nuclear, or we don't do anything about the efficiency of our buildings, or we don't manage to deploy or get ourselves ready to be able to deploy CC, carbon capture and storage. So that's what each of these bars shows. It shows the increase in cost associated with not having those options available to you. I think the interesting one on the end here, and I think this possibly changes, my colleagues haven't done updated figures following the recent announcements of just how low the costs for offshore wind have become because of the work that has been being done in this area, which are beating all the sort of expectations in terms of cost reductions at the moment. But this one's included, and in this analysis we said actually not having offshore wind available to you doesn't make a lot of difference to the cost. So if you've not got CCS available to you, you're potentially going to double the cost of going low carbon based on the analysis they've done. But if you haven't got offshore, it doesn't affect. But if you haven't got one of these options available to you, you certainly are going to need this one. So don't, for whatever you do, ditch it. Because until you've decided what mix of technologies you're going to have, which we still haven't because we aren't ready to deploy them at scale, then you need to keep that in the mix. You need to keep working on it, as indeed people have been. And interestingly, you've seen the impact of what happens when you do put a lot of engineering effort into a particular technology in terms of how you can bring the costs down. So I suppose the upshot of that is, for goodness sake, let's do the same sort of effort on these other options to see what we can do with those in terms of costs as well. That brings me on, I suppose, to the other key issue about this. This isn't just about electricity. And I think particularly when you look at how energy is used. So this is end use. So, I mean, if you think about the primary energy flows into the country, you do get a balance between energy flows through as electricity, transport and heat. But in terms of individuals using energy in their everyday lives, actually they use a lot less electricity than they do fuel for transport and energy as heat. And I think that makes a really important message. And certainly, I mean, I've worked in the electricity sector, so of course we've been ignoring heat for years. But I think the whole economy has been ignoring heat for years. And I think that's a real problem because it's a significant element of the carbon emissions, along with the transport piece. And potentially this one is quite resolvable, provided you're delivering the innovations and moving forward with things. There's an added complexity with it, though. And this is a graph by Robert Sansom, who's based at Imperial, from some work that was done by UKIRK back in 2011. But these figures haven't changed much since then. And what he does here is he plots the green line, which is the electricity use in the UK, which, as you can see, is actually varies, but doesn't actually vary that much compared to what happens with use of heat, which actually this is the use of gas that we're showing here, but primarily that flows through as heat and mainly as heat in people's homes. And I think the important things about this graph is this green line is very, very difficult to achieve. You know, everyone knows the story of the National Grid running their centre where they've got the television on so they can tell when people, you know, having their coffee break in Coronation Street. You know, it's a story that everyone seems to know. And we've been sold this story because actually they want us to keep us very synchronous in the way we use electricity. There's a very steady pattern to this. It varies between summer and winter, but not actually that much compared to what happens with gas, which swings. You know, we're just bracketing, but are bracketing in the middle of summer, the electricity demand. In the middle of winter, the peaks go up to 5 times the demand for electricity, but also in a day drop to less than the demand for electricity. And in the middle of winter, you can get 2 days that can look completely different from one another. And I think there's an important element in here which we're forgetting, or I think we risk forgetting as a country, is that can happen because our gas system is very resilient and has a lot of energy storage in it. And we're busy at the moment stripping energy storage out of the system. We're closing coal-fired power stations, which take a nice big store, very easily store, very, very good and effective store of energy out of the system, which I'm not an apologist for coal-fired combustion, but we do need to realise what we're doing as we shut those plants down. We're loading that potentially onto this gas system, so I do get concerned that we're not making enough investment in this gas system to allow us to keep this resilience that it offers us currently, because we're putting a lot of power generation potentially onto that gas system. And I think not only that, you've got the issue of, and actually, we can't have this here in 2050 because you can't afford to have all those point sources of CO2. So there's a big issue in terms of making investments in that gas system to keep it resilient, even though you're putting all the electricity onto it, because the people making those investments, it's not necessarily going to be a long-term investment unless you're convinced that you can change the fuel to something that doesn't deliver CO2 into people's homes, which is effectively what the gas system does currently. So there are things we can do. Obviously, we can work at bringing that demand down. We can reshape things so that they're not as peaky, using storage locally. The other piece we've done, of course, though, over the last few years is stripped out all the local storage of heat, because we persuaded everyone to buy combi boilers and no longer have a hot water tank in their homes. And now they've used that cupboard space for other purposes, so they won't want a hot water tank back in their homes as we try and deal with that issue. So there's a lot in this graph, and a lot of issues that we are going to have to be thinking about over the next few years with regards to our energy system. I suppose the other challenge in there, of course, and I've just alluded to it with the hot water tank thing, is that when you think about people and what they have in their homes and what they want to engage with as a product when it comes to energy, fewer than 4% of them today have any sort of low carbon heating. And if you go and talk to them about what they would like to do in the future, 90% of them would much prefer to have their gas central heating because that's what they've got at the moment, that's what they're happy with, that's what they're comfortable with. Doesn't mean that can't change over time. It has changed many times over the past, but that's another example of the sort of challenge that we have facing us as we try and bring about this low carbon, low cost, secure future for the energy system. Sorry, I forgot to introduce something back here. Part of what we were doing as we did this is we started to look at scenarios for energy. Now, lots of people do lots of scenarios, and most of those tend to be looking at the extremes. Working with our members, which includes government, we said what we needed to do was do something that looked at a couple of believable central scenarios. That doesn't mean we think these are scenarios for what will happen, but we do think they are, potentially what might happen in the middle space, not going to an extreme of gone green or going to an extreme of business as usual, but actually saying, if you were delivering an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 2050, what might things look like and how might that be positioned? And we finished up creating these two options around this. One, which we call clockwork, which was saying this is all going to be centrally driven. It'll come down from government. They will mandate what needs to be done and how it will be done. And the other one being patchwork, where the main sort of process for that change was a far greater engagement from the populace as a whole, and actually this is built from the bottom up. People get engaged in buying low carbon products, demanding that as they make purchases and as they make their own investments in their engagement in the energy system. And did a lot of analysis around that, around what it might look like and how it might work. And this is just a couple of the graphs that come out from there. But carrying on this story of what do you do about space heating? Given that you've got these challenges of building, use of energy in buildings. And this just shows you the sort of outputs of that work. I think the interesting thing about this is that all the bars, when you look at the clockwork system, and this is now terawatt hours, so it's volumes of energy per annum that are being used, all the bars are actually level. Now that doesn't mean that we haven't achieved anything. It just means that there has been a lot of work on efficiency, but all that efficiency has done is offset the growth in demand that is predicted using these linear predictions. You look at the patchwork system where people are more engaged and wanting to be more involved in solving the problem. The argument is you get better at using energy in buildings, you become more efficient in that use of energy, and so your bars by 2050 are lower, but not that much lower, because there's only so much you can do at a reasonable cost with the existing building stock in the UK. So you've got to find a low carbon solution, and on both we progressed from a mix of gas, primarily gas with some oil and some electricity, through to mixes on both sides of district heating, electricity and heat pumps. We've got a similar graph which shows the capacity, and in terms of capacity there's still gas available in 2050 because you still need it as a backup fuel for these other systems. But in terms of volumes of actual energy that's flowing, it's primarily delivered in this sort of scenario work by these three options. And I think the interesting thing is the difference in the balance between them, and this idea that actually if you go for a patchwork model, you finish up with less district heating, which seems counterintuitive, than if you go for this clockwork, centrally driven process. But the argument there is that if you go for the patchwork and let people sort of steadily build up their district heating schemes, none of them will work with one another in the end. Whereas if you go from a centrally mandated route, they will be forced to make sure that they're all regulated and the standards are met such that you can connect them together and you can build bigger heating systems, district heating systems by 2050. So almost a sort of a preference towards more district heating, but you've got to have some things in place to do it, and you absolutely won't be delivering the whole solution from district heat. So there's some of the complexity as we see it. How am I doing for time? I've gone on a bit too long, haven't I, already? 5 to 10 minutes, right. So all of that, of course, needs innovation. We're not going to get to any of those solutions if we aren't working hard at innovation. And as I said earlier on, we've probably got about 10 years to get ourselves to a point where we are ready to make the decisions and can start making decisions and can start deploying these technologies. And that innovation isn't just about technology. It's about market confidence, it's about finance, it's about policy, and actually having the capability in the system to deliver these innovations. So we've done quite a bit of work looking at what that all means and how it all fits together. And I think one of the pieces we've looked at is this usual sort of diagram that people have, this sort of linear model of innovation, saying that you go from basic R&D on one side all the way through to deployment of the new technology on the right. And if you're NASA, you add technology readiness levels across that, and you go from 0 at the far end through to 9 when you're decommissioning the systems at the end of their life. Some important messages as you look at that, though. It takes time to develop those innovation systems. It's taken a very long time to get to a point where we're now starting, I think, to deliver some innovation within the energy system, but there's still a long way to go with that. Weak or immature systems delay deployment, and I think that's what we've seen, because we have had a weak and immature innovation system within the energy sector. When I moved to E.ON, we weren't talking about low carbon. Our biggest concern at that time was NOx, because that was the challenge that faced the industry. It was only by the beginning of this century that we were actually getting really serious about how do you become part of solving the problems of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's only after that realization that we then started to worry about how the innovation gets driven. And I think the other thing here is that a new technology will pass through distinct stages on its way to the end. But that process is absolutely not linear. I suppose the other thing that comes in here is thinking about these ideas of technology push, a market pull, and this whole issue that people hit, a strike, and the issue that arguably the ETI was set up to be part of solving, this idea of this valley of death, where you're trying to deliver high-risk demonstration projects and they just don't happen because no one is willing to take the risk involved. And one of the issues with the energy sector is that those demonstration projects need to be big if you're going to believe that you're going to change the system using them. So it's either big power station units, which are very risky to build, or you've got to do a lot of small stuff, but at a scale. So you're rolling out something in a city to show that you can do low carbon retrofits on homes, you've got to do it at city scale to prove that this can be rolled out across the country. It's not just one or two buildings. And then you get this idea of the funnel of ideas flowing through, starting at this end, and as you move this way, you increase the value of these ideas as you work on them and improve them. You know, the example of offshore wind, just a classic example of something that's getting to this point now. But you will have a lot more ideas at the start, and many of them you will remove from the mix. But actually, that's fine. You know, so working on projects that don't actually get anywhere is part of the process. And I think we've not been good at it at ETI. One of the things is actually saying, this doesn't work, and here's why it hasn't worked, and let's move on to the next thing. Let's not just keep trying to keep something alive which isn't going to work, or maybe park it, because it may come back in the future under a different set of market conditions, but it's just not right for the process today. And that being a really important part of that process. And then, as you look at that, reflecting back again about it not just being this flow of a technology, there are a whole set of journeys that organisations have to go on. One of them being this capability journey, and I've illustrated it here, reflecting on our Smart Systems and Heat programme, where the challenge there is that you've got to link up a whole range of different technologies and different solutions at a city scale to try and address this issue of how you deliver a low carbon heating solution at city scale. You can have some technology driven capabilities for the companies when they first engage, but by the end of this, there are capabilities that have all got to be all about how you deliver technology at scale, which is very well, you've got a problem if you've still got technical issues by the time you're there. If you're in the market, you've got to be selling something that works, and you've proven it works. Totally de-risked, but there's a whole different set of skills within a company that's doing that than a company that's creating the new technologies. And that's repeated. So not only have you got that the capability piece, you've got a similar journey that you can tell, story you can tell around the public policy, a similar story around finance, and another story you can tell around confidence, market confidence and expansion. And all of these sort of flow from one end to the other as the technology moves through, but all of them are iterative. You learn things as you go along, that feedback. And one of the issues I have when I'm working with the research councils is often you'll hear people say, oh, this isn't research council activity because it's TRLs 6, 7 and 8. And you say, well, what happens when you hit a problem at TRL 8 that you need a fundamental... my example of that is I spent 10 years of my life working on big old power stations. We were still undertaking TRLs 1, 2 and 3 research in solving the problems that we were having in operating those plants, because you were doing different things with them to what they were designed to do. So this piece is iterative, and we've got to get that message across to people that innovation isn't just throw it over the fence to the next group, deal with it. It's an iterative process that involves everyone. Which I suppose brings me on to my next slide. That whole thing about successful innovation systems will involve open and iterative processes, and there's a lot of complexity in there. And I suppose just a couple of final messages out of the work we've been doing, and one of them is about knowledge. And it's about this issue of actually what do you do with the things you learn, and how do you deliver impact with it. We spent a lot of time working on this, and we still haven't got it right. When we started, though, looking at what we were doing, we were very focused down here. We were good at acquiring and organising knowledge and data, and we were okay at disseminating that data. The thing that we've realised that we really needed to do was get much better at communicating the knowledge we'd been discovering, and then working with the people who use that knowledge to then inform what we do next. Actually, sort of, so we get feedback from it and build on the activity. And I could spend a whole session talking about that, and I won't, but just to sort of say that has been a key learning that we've had on the way through, that knowledge management is crucial when you work in this sort of space, And actually, it's about getting stuff to people and then understanding what they do with it when you get it to them. And I suppose this comes into the piece around actually delivering impact and this whole idea that impact is about outcomes. You know, we've had this headline outcome that we've wanted all the way through, which is this 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. As part of that, we're also saying that we want to build confidence in the sector. We want to support the supply chain, and we want to be working with and giving evidence to the policymakers. So those are the outcomes we're seeking. Our projects, the outputs from our projects don't do that. You know, I think there was a sort of an assumption in the early days. In fact, I think there still is an assumption with some of my colleagues that, well, if ETI says that's how it's going to work, they're just going to listen and they're going to go ahead and do it. That doesn't work. The reality is very much more about understanding who is going to benefit from the outputs of that work, but then support these outcomes we're seeking and really getting our heads round what those people need and how we tailor our outputs to deliver to them. And I think the other piece in here is that doesn't just mean that we've got knowledge for those beneficiaries, those players in the game, but we also get to understand them. So we get some knowledge about them, and ultimately we're getting knowledge from them, which informs how we take things forward. So to close and to hand over to Kim, I think the important bit about this is that this whole process is about shared understanding. And I think certainly the experience we've had is it has to be a shared understanding between research, but also business and industry and government. And without that shared understanding, we aren't going to make the progress that we need to make in the energy sector. And now I'll hand over to Kim to tell you how he thinks it should be done.
Okay, guys. So Mike's done a actually fairly succinct description there of the kind of challenges that the ETI has been dealing with and the UK is facing. So I was going to spend maybe 15-20 minutes just running through some techniques that have come out of product development area in Japan, just to show how we started working together on ways of improving that knowledge flow and that communication across different parts of the supply chain for sustainable energy. Would you like me to launch straight into that and get through it? Or would you like 2 minutes?
If anyone's going to ask a question of clarification.
Yeah.
I think this whole issue of the cost after the low carbon future, and Osborne was very famous inventor. This is a wonderful thing, the green economy and so forth, but we really can't afford it. And he obviously hasn't read the report from the Stern produced in his own department. But another factor here in the cost equation is now when 40,000 people are dying prematurely from particulates, all of a sudden this is now a major driver, so to speak, for the low carbon economy. And almost overnight, all the big motor companies are now saying this is going to be our target, where we're starting to go for the electric and hybrid and so on. And so I think we've actually got when we're talking about the costs of the low carbon economy, we talk about the cost of the polluting economy to our people now, and it's not just those who elder ones who are dying prematurely. More drastic is the younger people, particularly children, whose life expectancy is going to be impaired and quality of life going to be impaired. And this seems to be now a new factor, a new dimension that is going to help to drive what we could broadly call the low carbon we could illustrate a number of cities throughout the world, including locally in the UK, that are actually moving towards a low carbon city, and how they're doing it, how it's costing, what are the benefits, and so on. And I think making a positive case demonstrated by what has been achieved.
There's probably not a question there, but do you want to comment, or should we?
I mean, I think, yeah, I know most what you said there, and certainly involved in activities that actually try with that. I think there is an interest in air quality in that it is the thing of the moment, and that's one of the issues that we do face in the energy sector, is that we've gone from this sort of long period of we did things one way to there have been lots of solutions and things fit in and out of the narrative, and the way that things are shaped fit in and out of the narrative as well. So whilst air quality is the issue this year, next year it will be something else. But yes, we do need to respond to those needs and the money because they forget as well.
Okay, right. I'll kick on. We've just heard Mike cover the first two bullet points. I'm going to do a very short soft systems overview. Really what Mike was bringing through was the broad complexity of the transition we're talking about in terms of the number of stakeholders that need to participate actively, the way that we generate knowledge and the way we share and build on knowledge, build confidence in knowledge. So the one of the key points Mike was bringing up was about how do we build up investor confidence, business confidence in some of the solutions that potentially help us achieve that 2050 target, which potentially will include issues to do with overall impact of pollutants on the atmosphere, not just CO2, although CO2 is a major part of that. So back in late 60s, so I'm just going to introduce one of the guys who coined the phrase soft systems method. A chap called Peter Checkland was a senior manager of working at ICI, that famous ancient British chemical industry company. And one of the things he was looking at was the kind of decision-making process that was being done for complex businesses where you are trying to marry together market demand for petrochemicals with production capacity, which might be specifically targeted at particular ways of particular types of chemical. So what he was specifically trying to do was to understand, was the emerging field of systems engineering that was coming out of much of the aerospace industry in the States from organizations like NASA, but some of the that Mike referred to earlier, were they relevant to these complex management decision-making problems? So he started trying to apply early systems engineering methodology. And as we'll see in a second, Peter Checkland eventually transferred into academia. So he moved into Lancaster University, been working with Lancaster, and he realized that actually the big challenge is that many of the problems faced in complex industries are really ones where even the problem is not fully understood or understood in different ways. And very often people have very different views of what the best solution is. So what he tried to construct was a framework where a team, multidisciplinary team, achieve an understanding of this multi-dimensional problem. And it's typically moving from a fairly unstructured problem definition through a process of refinement such that more structure is provided and a more in-depth understanding of the nature of the problem, so that the problem situation is properly expressed, which is the second box. Unfortunately, it's not very visible to you guys. That's the second box down on the left, which then starts to stimulate ideas in the solution space. So having gone from an unstructured problem statement into a more structured problem statement, to then start building some potential root solutions to the problems, and then through a series of conceptual models to start to build potential routes to a solution definition. And if you think of the reference to the ESME modeling, you could say that that's doing some of this conceptual modeling. What are the different scenarios we might use? And what do we believe the model tells us about how this might pan out over time? And having sort of gone through this process, to then bring that back out into the real world, as it were, into composition of the potential solution. So now we're starting to build and develop the model in the real world. So it comes from the external environment, goes through the internal analysis processes into conceptual modeling, up into comparison of the problem situation with the potential models that have been created. So this proved to be very successful when it was first applied in some of the complex business areas, but there were limitations. And some of the limitations surrounded how you move from this phase, where you've got a concept, into a more specific innovation or technical development. If we talk about there being technical and business components of the solution. And really that's one of the things that I've suggested in some of the work I was doing with Mike at the ETI. So I was working with Smart Systems and Heat program, one of the 9, as it was then, I think there's 10 programs now, but one of the 9 major programs being run at the ETI. But I was then working with Mike with some of these techniques to look at the other programs, to start structuring them, to give more clarity about how we translate from the soft systems model into, and therefore what are we going to do on a practical basis. Please do jump in, Mike, when I go off script and mislead everybody in the room. So it's really about coming from fuzzy problem space into focused action. So the up arrow is really the focused action, okay? And please don't strain your eyes trying to read this. Typically the soft, complex management problems, though, typified by different stakeholders, different views of the problem, different views of priorities and solutions. So how do we navigate through those aspects? Another aspect of this was that it was recognized the more often that the model was applied, the soft systems method was applied, that really there were key factors really captured with the CATWO mnemonic, which is basically customers, actors, transformation process, worldview, owner, and environmental constraints. So what are the things constraining the way the business can deploy solutions? And that just gives a bit more definition on each of those. I'm just going to run through fairly quickly. So if I now link back into, very often when we talk about system development programs, so one of the areas I lecture here at Warwick now is engineering systems. Typically the model that's quoted is the NASA model, which is the V model, which really starts to run from a point where you've got a business case of feasibility and you've got a clear statement of requirements. And this is really about the process of decomposing requirements and translating them into solution components, and then making sure that we're integrating and testing as we got the right hand arm of the V. You know, that's a 30-second summary of what the V model. It's often quoted without necessarily people understanding what it is, as the almost the systems development framework. The challenge you have, and there are different levels you operate at: architectural, subsystem, or entity and components. So the further you go down, the more you're doing to define components, and then you're integrating the components as you go up the right-hand side, testing them, making sure everything's working. You could see the energy system as a huge one of these, absolutely huge one of these in the UK. And you would say it's a multiple number of fees and architectures and subsystems. This is a model that came out from NASA in about 1990. But if you look at the left-hand side, at the top we've got the development of solution ideas, and to my mind that's where the soft systems method comes in. And you might argue that actually the problem we've got is in transferring from that soft systems method, which is about developing robust solution concepts and ensuring that we have a clearly defined set of requirements which then go into a technical or business development, system development framework. That's a very quick summary. One of the challenges I think that sits out there, because I think this is the bit, the linkage from that down into the system development framework is really weak. So I've spent 26 years working in automotive systems and aerospace systems first, IT systems for about 10 years, constantly coming across the problem, either launching programs, or discovering that actually stakeholders weren't understood, the solution that's been proposed is not actually appropriate. The history of me in IT was I became the Victor Meldrew of IT. As in, I would stand there trying to placate the customer and quietly saying, I don't believe what we've just done to them. So, and it's because this top-end development hasn't been done in a structured way. So this is part of what we were trying to work together on at the ETI. So I'm just going to step from that, from the soft systems overview, and linking down into system development, into why therefore am I going to talk a little bit about some methods for policy deployment and something called QFD, and why that might be a good way of structuring this linkage from SSM down into system development. And to understand where much of this thinking emerged, if we go back to Japan in the mid-1960s, Japan had, under the guidance of people like Edward Deming from the States, Armand Feigenbaum, again from the States, achieved what can only be described as a miraculous transformation. They'd gone from an absolutely destroyed economy, little in the way of resources, little in the way of capital to invest, and through a focus on application of statistical process control and quality concepts, transform the manufacturing base. The challenge they still had, as we'll see in a second, was that they still had not understood how to design things that were really wanted in the marketplace. And one of the aspects of this was a failure to link vision of an organization, what kind of policy are we setting to try and establish that vision, and how it links down into the day-to-day activities of staff in the organization. So there was a real mismatch. Or, this lowest layer, which is really the day-to-day operational activities, management by objectives approach. A lot of organizations today still try to manage purely on a almost independent management by objectives. Where the objectives come from, nobody really knows. They might happen to flow down from on high, but very often it's more by hit and miss them by any kind of coherent manner. So, as an example, the vision that might have been heard out in Japan at the time, we want to be, as Lexus, the specialist brand or the high value brand of Toyota. We want to beat Mercedes-Benz in the market. This is the kind of area that this technique was being used or became used in. So there's a huge gap, and the reality was that it was recognised that because there was this gap, there was a high probability that development wasn't focused on high-level goals and objectives of the company, wasn't part of the strategy. And anybody I think who's worked in industry will recognise these symptoms in many of the projects they've worked on. I certainly did, as I say, sort of getting this all the time. So one of the issues was, how do we link vision down to focus on targets? So how do we get the tie together so that the local objectives of people in the organisation tie back up into the vision? And this chap, Yoji Okao, was working with Edward Stemming on the development of TQM concepts, which were really the things that revolutionised manufacturing. But what Yoji was doing, and I had the pleasure of meeting this guy in 2010, what Yoji was doing was pushing the button and asking the question, how do we move from this disconnected design process and this disconnected set of objectives to a more structured way of linking these things together so that we really get TQM, but actually in the design phase and in the way we design the operation, the organisation. So he provided, he's famous for two things. He's a co-developer of a method called QFD, Quality Function Deployment, but he's also, at the same time, he created something called Hoshinkanri, which is policy deployment technique for linking vision down to personal objectives in the organisation. Get alignment. Make sure that what you work on adds value to what the organisation's trying to do. And he also developed a method, QFD, and we're going to look at that very quickly in a second. Quality function deployment. It doesn't really tell you what it's doing, but really it's a way of tying together solutions that you develop, very early stage of design, right back into what are the needs of the stakeholders, customers and stakeholders. And so I'm going to look at that very quickly. But as with many of these things, the Hoshinkanri, the policy deployment, he used the model of navigating a boat. If the organisation is trying to sail upwind, you learn how to tack. And you use a compass to say, where are we trying to get to? So his idea was that actually this policy deployment was the way of providing a compass needle in the company to help you line up and know, even when you're having to divert, where you're trying to get to. A very similar concept actually to what the QFD method does. You know, what's really important, how do we keep to that? How do we make sure we don't lose value during development? So, I mentioned QFD. QFD is quality assurance and design. It's really taking TQM out of the manufacturing into the design process. So how do we make sure what we design, the system or the product or the strategy that we design, focuses on what's really needed? It's just a very systematic way of doing it. And the reason you do it in design is because it's magnitudes of order cheaper to change to something that's a better design than it is to change something that's already been developed and try and modify it and fix it. And this came through in things like automotive, where changes that are happening in late production are 200, 300 times as expensive to change as they are during the design phase. They're also much, much longer. So if you're involved in a program such as an energy systems development program, to start changing late on, it's too late. So this is all about how do we get this right up front and make sure that we design positive quality in, not test poor quality out. So this is the core principle. I'm not going to go into too much detail other than to say they picked up an idea that had been developed at Bridgestone Tyre a little earlier, which was in their its Japanese division, Bridgestone, trying to work out, okay, what the customer wants is smooth ride. When they buy our tyres, they want to be assured they're going to get smooth ride. How do we make sure that everything we do that we can control leads to that outcome? You know, satisfies that need is another way of saying that. So all that Yoji Ikao and Shigeru Mitsuno did was they took that concept, and by 1968 they turned it into multi-level needs, stakeholder analysis, which translates systematically into a set of solution requirements. So that's the starting point. You know, it's a lot more that goes on through the QFD process, but that's where they started. Most people, when they get trained in QFD, I was trained in this in 1990. I was working at a group called Lucas Engineering and Systems at the time. We were working on how to revolutionize our manufacturing systems to make sure we didn't go out of business. Unfortunate occurrence had happened in our marketplace in that these flipping Japanese companies had followed Toyota and Nissan into the UK. And what we discovered, because what was evident was that they'd cracked this issue of how do we develop high quality, low cost product, whereas we've been majoring on low quality, high cost for decades. And we were really horrified to discover that customer really prefers the Japanese model on this front. So it was really incumbent on us to work out how do we do the same thing. So we were studying how are the Japanese doing this? How are they transforming the way they develop products, the way they manufacture them, the way they create a supply chain? We discovered actually one of the key elements was this area that they were doing much more analysis on what's needed, what's the implication of that design right through the manufacturing process and to delivery. So it's very much supporting concurrent engineering. So in a nutshell, what Yoji Ikao had developed was a way of vertically aligning with an enterprise by making sure you tie all the layers of the hierarchy of the organization, making sure the objectives line up using the compass needle of the policies to the vision, and going across the organization, cross-functional management, using QFD to line everything up on delivery of customer value. So this was all about focus and bringing clarity about what's customer value. The reason it came to people's attention, the reason I mentioned Lucas trying to survive the onslaught of the Japanese, because they were very close to bankruptcy, 1988, 89. I joined in 1990. Should have sent them under, but didn't. The reason I mention it was because the company that really brought fame to Yoji Ikao was this little car company in Japan called Toyota. And Toyota had improved their manufacturing quality, but they were really struggling to get out of Japan. They had real problems with reliability. And I'm old enough to remember people seeing Japanese cars as a bit of a joke back in the 70s. Not the kind of, you know, premier example of high quality, high reliability. Toyota had a real reliability problem with company cars like the Camry. Between 77, they brought Yoji Ikao in, asked him to show them how to do policy deployment, put QFD in. 7-year program. What they achieved was 65% reduction in development costs and 35% reduction in development time. When that was communicated to America, the US automotive industry went nuts. It's basically oh my goodness, they're going to kill us. Because not only were they achieving these significant improvements, they're also getting a huge improvement in the customer uptake response to the product. The rest in many ways is history. This is exactly what happened to Lucas. We were almost destroyed by taking this different approach. And the issue in many ways, the difficulty I think for complex situations is that very often we're driven by the need to do evaluation of what the problem is in a very short time with minimal resources. Whereas the Japanese were spending more time to really get underneath what is the problem. So if you look at the soft systems method, it's very much about spending more time understanding the problem. So my recommendation is that the techniques that came out of Japan fit very nicely with the SSM method for understanding and translating key customer needs. So I'm as I say, well in fact it was 61% development cost, 33% development time reduction, and near elimination of the warranty issues they had. A lot of effort gone in, but now they've got something that's really competitive in the marketplace. Very few other car companies could compete with this at the time. So just about every American car company announced everybody's going to use QFD now. So the Americans adopted this highly simplified model, which is typically what's taught in things like Design for Six Sigma today. So, and this is really about going from custom needs at the left hand to production controls, making sure all the time you're focusing on where is the high quality, where's the high impact. So, there's a standard that's taken best practices. It was released in 2015. So I sit as the UK rep on the standard development for QFD. But it's doing these different aspects described in an 8-part standard. It's, I think, 4 bar 2 parts are now released. And we're now actively developing the next release. So I'll be focusing on how do we apply this to system development based on some of the work we've been doing, Mark. So if we look at the problem that Mike described earlier, if we look at the UK energy trilemma, thinking in terms of policy deployment at this point, what are the things that guide organisations involved in sustainable energy? So if we look at the outcomes the UK is looking for, CO2 and greenhouse gas targets achieved by 2050, affordable low CO2 energy supply, secure low CO2 energy. So if we take some of the models that have been developed using this policy deployment, a simple way of structuring what are the goals at different levels helps us understand the connectivity. So if we look at that as the outcomes, major customer, for want of a better description, for the ETI, but also a partner within the organisation, DBEIS, department. It was named just after I'd written the paper, so it was DEC. But they are looking for things like policy development, facilitating, so they're trying to work out what the policy should be to really encourage a transition to low CO2 or low greenhouse gas. So, to support this affordable low CO2 energy supply, it's all about creating the conditions for sustainable supply chain, because without a supply chain, the best innovations in the world will not happen. And then I'm just using very simple examples to show the flow down. So this is basically the agency level, investor and industry confidence in low CO2 energy built. So if we think of this as the top of the policy tree, this is sitting way outside most organisations, but there is a chain that flows down and should be recognised. I use the word should be recognised because I don't think it is. I think most organisations run without any understanding of their goals and the context they provide for what's being done. Personal opinion, so happy to be shot down and beaten up and kicked out. So what this is trying to show is that using some of the techniques coming out of policy deployment and QFD, while I was working at the ETI with Mike, we started creating tables where we were looking at the outcomes for the EIS over at the top, ETI outcomes that support those outcomes. So what's ETI trying to achieve that hits those? How are we going to measure it? What time frame? Who judges success? Who's going to say, yeah, that's a good development, or that's a good goal that's been developed there? And these become really important because they're initial ideas on who are the critical stakeholders. You might need to go and find out what do they consider the criteria for success. So if we go down, we could take that ETI outcome and then start breaking it out into, as an example, the program I was sitting in, Smart Systems and Heat. So support development, investor and industry confidence at the top left, and these are some of the ETI outcomes: enabling ability to design local sustainable energy networks, key stakeholder engagements. Again, working very closely with Mike and with other members of the management team to get the engagement going, and enabling sustainable energy management at a building level. So these sort of almost provide the top level goals, outcomes that help direct our program. And the Smart Systems and Heat program, when I joined, was a £100 million program. So it's not small activity. Something else coming out of the QFD is the critical message is about prioritising, getting focus on what's really high value. Don't assume that everything's the same value. It's not. The way I describe this is, various points in my career I became a program manager in automotive, in IT systems. So if I have £10 to spend on my program, I've got to make sure I focus that £10 on the high value, high return part of the program. If I wasted it doing side issues, then I rightly should be castigated for it, because I haven't found out what's really important for the customers and stakeholders. I think too often programs run where we've got a set of targets, we're going to just deliver them. End of story. And some people think success is, I did it all to the plan. My question is always, well, did that plan change the day after you wrote it? And did you understand why it changed? Because very often the answer is, yes, it did change, and I have no idea why it changed. So, this prioritization technique is something called AHP, Analytical Hierarchy Process. It's actually a very simple process whereby you do a comparison between, in this case, program goals to understand which one is more important and how much is it more important. And the primary use of importance here is if we achieve that goal, how much does it contribute to the overall success of the program? So it's just one of those areas where you have to come to an understanding of what does success mean for this program. Again, it starts feeding back into some of the high-level goals that you're trying to achieve and outcomes. I'm not taking you through the detail, guys, because it'll kill you. You won't be able to read it. I'm just going to try and explain the key features. So basically, this is about starting to say, where is their value in the program? Whether it's Smart Systems and Heat, whether it's the overall ETI program, which is a huge program that's being run, is being run. So there's some key things here where some of the techniques out of QFD are really helping, and policy deployment are helping to structure almost the overall quantitative values that you might associate or need for the soft systems method. Okay. Another technique that proves very useful at this point, and this is coming out of a standard Six Sigma toolbox, is something called a SIPOC, suppliers, inputs, processes, outputs, customers. As I explained to people, you've always got to do as a COPIS. You've got to understand who the... I know why they don't call it COPIS, why they call it SIPOC, because the Americans don't like to be rude. But starting from an understanding who the customers or the key stakeholders are, flowing it across what outputs they expect, what are the processes needed to transform inputs into outputs, and who are the suppliers. Again, this now continues to build the message about who are the key stakeholders. Key quality concept from Japan is if you break the chain of communication about quality at any one point, whether it's a supplier who didn't quite know what they were supplying or why they were supplying it, or a process manager who doesn't quite know what the input to output transformation is, then you potentially got a failure in quality. Now, if you think of what Toyota did, the difference for Toyota, and it's existing today, and we've got a lot of investment on site from Jaguar Land Rover, the difference is that Toyota have driven this kind of thinking right through their supply chains. So this ability to be very succinct in the way they communicate what does quality mean. And I'd say it's a differentiator to this day from companies like Jaguar. There's still a lot of confusion coming down supply chains. But when you get to the energy systems sector, I'd say it's even worse. There's a lack of clarity about what Mike was talking about the TRL levels from NASA. What does this really need to operate at before we can sensibly put it into a solution demonstration? If we're talking about a big investment, you need to be really confident that we understand the quality requirements for that innovation when it gets put in there. Because the last thing you can afford is, we spent 20 million on this demonstration, which was there to try and build industry confidence, and then to discover there's one component in this solution that failed and brought a really bad reputation to the rest of the program. As a program manager, I know how painful that is. When you suddenly discover one of your suppliers has not understood what you've been trying to say to them. And it does cause a huge amount of stress in the development arena. So anyway, this technique helps flesh out. So while I was at the ETI, I was working with a local team developing the SIPOC for the smart systems and the heat program. Fairly significant piece of work, but at the end of it we had a very clear picture of who supplied what to us, where our outputs would go, and how it's going to influence main quality issues. Okay, so that's really about supply chain and understanding more about stakeholders. Having started to build this list of stakeholders, it's again where the HP method comes in as a very handy technique for prioritizing. And what we're doing now, and you can't see it, so I'll just point it out, we've got 3 of the high-level outcomes. Slight shading on those. There's 3 rows here. And across the top, we've got the key stakeholders that we've been able to identify. Who do we think impacts the success or failure of our program? Because some of the worst stakeholders you find are the hidden ones, the ones who actually change something in the external environment and kill your program stone dead. If you've been involved in a long development activity, there's nothing as annoying as, I've spent 3 years of my life, blood, sweat and tears getting this program together. Somebody in Whitehall has just changed something and my program has just been killed because they didn't understand the impact of what they've done on the rest of the chain. When Mike and I wrote a paper that's behind this last year, we used carbon capture and storage as a classic example. Government not realising what their policy change was doing. and it's part of this hokey-cokey that goes on with policy. Let's change the focus. I've got to say, when I was first doing this at the ETI, and we're looking at smart systems and heat program, within 6 months, we'd set out what we thought as a team the goals were, then reviewed it 6 months later with the chief engineer, Andrew Hazlitt, a few other guys, and they said the priorities have changed. So a different political flavour comes through now. So that one, which wasn't very important, has now become the most important. Now, potentially what you're doing is you're trying to align your program to delivery of value. So if the value is changing in the background, which it does, but all I'd say is it's better to be in that position than to have no idea what the value is. So it's almost better to be working from that standpoint. Okay. So anyway, the significance of this is you're asking the question, how does each of these stakeholders impact delivery of success for the goal? And it's quite funny, actually, how preconceptions before going into these workshops get changed, well, by doing this simple analysis. And this is really coming off the back of Yoji Ikao's ideas around KFD, but applied now to his other big area, which is policy deployment. Because what you end up with is a percentage impact of each of the stakeholders. So you can start to say, well, actually, this is a small but significant stakeholder. So this is what we need to do with them to make sure they stay on side. It might be that we just keep communicating with them so that they're aware of how what they're doing might be influencing what we're doing. Okay. Yeah, so in terms of the smart systems, if you remember, I was talking about CATWO earlier, you know, the mnemonic about what are key aspects. So what this is really doing is starting to help you understand the relative impact of actors, owners, and customers. So the AC and O. Because every stakeholder is not equal. So any program that tries to say, I'm going to meet every objective in this program, they're lying to you. It can't be done. Because the complexity is too large. So you do have to focus on value. You know, and it's business value. It's also, at times, it might actually be PR value. It might be part of the, oh, we've got to do this because we've got to sell this concept to help illustrate why this aspect is so important. I'm not sure I need to go through this really, but just to say a step beyond this was to go from the stakeholder analysis we're doing for SSH using that stakeholder impact table, and then starting to build something called a customer voice table, which is really starting to build a picture of what are the key needs of each of those important stakeholders. And there are various techniques for building a clear understanding. What I discovered in my career, my varied career, was that quite often what you think are important customer needs, you discover when you start doing this kind of analysis are not actually that important. It's really useful to get a customer in the room and say, well, if you had a choice between this one or this one, which is the one that's really going to make a difference to you? It's stunning the number of times that they told you one's really important, and then you discover, no, it's way down in the weeds. Because the person who probably put the rating on it didn't understand. So often the customer, it's such a complex scenario, this, that key people will not understand the real significance. Which again is why the Japanese went for this idea of multi-skills, multi-views, being involved in these kind of workshops. So much of my career has been running workshops, trying to almost beat out of the customer what is really important to you, and also being pretty skeptical right at the beginning that what they've told you is true. So relevant to this, the customer voice table, because what you're trying to do is identify critical needs. You will be using something like AHP to prioritize those needs, to say which ones are really high value, which ones low value. But the whole purpose of the QFD approach is to say, okay, we understand the needs, and this is a very simplified version of it. What does that imply for the solution requirements? What's that mean? The solution must do. So that, again, you start building a picture of this is what's important for us to design against. So this is almost a starting point for the design team. Or it might be the development team, if you're doing a significant technology innovation. Because I've used this in both scenarios. So anyway, as I say, you would use something like AHP, start building up the picture of which of these is most important. And the QFD really starts building a percentage relative impact of, as an example, temperature setting on those different stakeholder needs. So this is direct from the SSH program. So across the top, you've got solution requirements. Down the left, you've got needs. Now you're trying to say, okay, how much does the solution requirement satisfy the need? This is the fundamental process in QFD. So it's a translation process, trying to flesh out where is the high value. And it's purely because it's recognized in typical developments, something as simple as a car compared with an energy transition, you really can lose the plot very, very quickly. You can lose the thread of why is this solution requirement really important. This is what the Japanese were finding. Design team hadn't picked up on the critical ones and they focused on low importance. It's not because they're stupid, it's because there's so much information you need a way of almost bringing a searchlight to it and saying that's where the high value is. So going through this, sorry guys, tiring end of day and it's ice train slides. So again, I'll just explain very quickly. One of the key points that comes off this, as soon as you've got solution requirements, you start to have a criteria whereby you can start doing design. So to date, I've not been talking about design. I've been talking about setting up the criteria whereby you can start doing design. And one of the things that's proposed, and it comes most strongly in things like Design for Six Sigma, is you start to generate different concepts that might satisfy the solution requirements or the design requirements. And the reason I say you do multiple concepts, this is exactly what we did in the SSH program, is that you're trying to make sure that you have covered off satisfaction of the design requirements, which are tied back into the customer needs. And then you're using a table to reinforce the message of what's really important to the design and making sure you're creating several design concepts. The main reason you do that is because history is littered with companies who've developed the one concept because that's what they funded. Now, I saw this at TRW, where I worked. Yeah, TRW took over Lucas eventually. When I mentioned now we design concepts, there's a sharp intake of breath in one of the workshops, and they out in Dusseldorf, and they said, "What do you mean concepts? We only do one. We're doing one design. That's what we've got." Yeah, but surely you're doing multiple concepts and finding out which one's good, because the first one might be a bad one. Okay. So we did exactly this at the Smart Systems and Heat program, generated concepts, and this is for sustainable heat management within a building. So it's one chunk of the program. It's not the complete program. We're using the V model to structure the concepts to make sure we had identified key systems, subsystems that we needed, and then we evaluated those using a very simple technique called Pew Matrix, which uses the design criteria as your evaluation criteria, and then you check off which of these designs are good, satisfying those. What you typically end up with is one of the designs is better than the others, So this has got a 7, and that's called Alternative Smart Design Approach. And this one's got a 3, which just means it hit more positives than the other designs. But that's almost a starting point before you start to say, okay, where was it weak as a design, and can we ship strong points from other designs into that solution? So we start optimizing the concept. So when I was first introduced to this in automotive, it was called concept convergence. But it came out of Strathclyde University, Professor Pugh, who's a leading thinker in the UK on product or competitive product design. So anyway, it's just a technique that you can use it for anything. So I've used it to evaluate different suppliers. I was working as a program manager at Northrop Grumman, and we were trying to work out which of several suppliers was best for us. So I just use a few matrix. What's the criteria? I'm going to evaluate them against which one comes out best. Okay, so I'm really going to bring this to a close now, because you're all pretty much asleep. So a lot of these techniques, you know, they started off life looking at things like car development. First using KFD in Japan was Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in '72. So ship development today, medical devices, energy systems, IT systems. So I've used it repeatedly to help me design complex enterprise systems. There's a chap at Warwick now, Professor Mark Skilton. So I did some of my work with Mark when we were at CSC together, looking at service-orientated architecture. So it's one of those techniques you just need to think, how am I going to apply this? And it's really got the flexibility to help you focus in, high value. How does it feed right down through the supply chain? And I think one of the key challenges you've got is that the soft systems thinking is typically done by people who think in a more less quantitative way, more of a qualitative way, and they tend to be more senior people in the management structure. And going into the areas of QFD, it starts becoming much more of a quantitative analysis. And I think the big challenge is bringing the thinking together. So it's finding ways of making these methods communicate effectively to both sides of that, both sides of the brain, because it's through that you get the sharing of knowledge and the communications that are required. And experience with these techniques is that it really does help get clarity across complex. A lot of the work I was doing was ETI was with Mike, applying it to looking at different programs. And I think you've found that you've continued with many of these techniques. So that's really it, guys. And to me, it's just a way of translating from the soft systems world down into hard systems, hard business solutions, and back up into real deployable solutions. And I personally, I would say this, I personally think it's really critical to things like sustainable energy transitions. Because I don't think you can do the kind of complexity that's involved without this attempt to understand value and how it flows. So that's it. Sort of. And I'll never lie to you again about 20 minutes because. So. Yeah.
How do you go about that? Do you have to treat them as though they're part of the company and pretty much tell them everything?
One of the key things, and this is something you've got to do with a bit of care, because there are aspects of programs where you don't want your supplier to know everything, but there are pieces. So as an example, we were doing an enterprise system for a large London-based police force, and one of the issues with that was that we had a subcontractor, in effect they were a partner, who were going to be doing a lot of the software development. So we got them heavily engaged in the what we call voice of the customer workshops. We were working with different stakeholder groups, flush out, so there was complete clarity, because it's all about achieving clarity for what's important for the supplier or the partner. I do feel that one of the challenges for UK automotive, it's improving because there's been a strong influence from the Japanese, but the Japanese have much more of a win-win mindset than some of the UK companies. Got to be careful to say that.
So, can I ask, when you were applying this through SSH process, are there some things you would point to that said you came up with a particularly better position or concept you don't think you thought of if you hadn't?
Yeah, well, in fact, what I would say is that when we got through the front end of the QFD and we got some solution requirements, the design team didn't have a problem jumping to a solution that, all of the concepts that were generated had different ways of achieving similar things. So what it gave us was just a bit more confidence in selecting, actually that's a really good design, whereas that concept maybe, is just lacking in certain areas. What I would say is that the other thing it started doing was it helped us to start structure almost a release program. So it said actually we might be looking for a baseline version of this concept. So it started helping us to establish what is a baseline and which then is a more advanced development demonstrator. Because a lot of what we're trying to do here was to link back to helping with establishing investor industry confidence in the marketplace. So we were trying. Sorry? Well, I left the program after 18 months. Yeah. I've still got friends. It's now become the Energy Systems Catapult, that program. So that's now based up in Birmingham. We were based on Birmingham Business Park when I was there, but it's moved up into town. So I can find out, what's happened with the program, but I haven't been in contact now for a couple of years.
How do you factor instinct into that?
Yeah, it's one of the aspects with this is part of it drives you to start working out how would I measure. What is the thing that would tell me that people have moved a particular way because they're following an instinct, which might be influenced by social practices. We were talking about this earlier. Is that what you're getting at? Absolutely. Now the interesting one with that is it forces you to think, because you almost have to step back and start saying, is there a way I could show what's influencing the way that customer behavior is going? So rather than just saying we think it's an instinct, are there ways that you can find that say, yeah, that it is about making this explicit rationalization at the end of the day, because obviously from a design point of view, it is difficult if you're trying to design against something that's a little hard to, there are weaknesses in the method, and there have been techniques evolved to try and capture emotional response to certain things, because again, if you look at consumer behaviors, some of that comes out of emotional response because of what's going on in society. And it might be that aspects of your solution will be rejected because it's perceived to be part of that very flaky, insecure internet. Absolutely. And my sense with it, because that crops up quite often, is it's almost, you take it as far as you can at the beginning, And then as things start to appear and you think, actually, we're not capturing that properly, it gives you the opportunity to go back and say, okay, how would we describe that? How do we rationalize it and make it explicit? Yeah. For me, the beauty of it is you start building a pathway, and very quickly as change happens, which it does all the time, you have the opportunity to go back and see what's changed. So as I say, within 6 months of setting out what we thought were the priorities for the goals for SSH, we were told they've changed. The priority here has flipped right round because of political change. So we were able to go back and evaluate very quickly what's that mean? How does that flow down into the program? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, to flush out where there's weakness in the assumptions. And in fact, going back in history, that's exactly what was happening in Japan. The design teams back in the mid-60s were assuming they knew the answers. They knew what the customer needed. You know, what was evident was they didn't, because the product wasn't selling. You know, they're making poor design decisions, which meant the product was not really something that was competitive. So a lot of this is about competitive design thinking. Well.
You're saying we, I think it's obviously very well established that design is cheap, better design is cheaper than
Yeah.
other bits that got downstream. But I mean, I have this all the time with students when I'm student project.
Yeah.
And the student wants to produce a report.
Yeah.
Because for God's sake, you know, he's got 80 pages to write, and he needs to start writing a damn
Yeah.
thing now. And you're telling him, no.
Step
Wait
back.
and work out what is the best thing to do.
And
That's just in the student.
yeah, and in a company it's worse.
Oh, I can imagine.
In a company it's worse. Yeah, I worked in a software development company and trying to get over basic concepts of quality, real challenge, because, you know, no, we've got to get out the door. Yes, but it's rubbish. It will come back. It will hurt us. And dealing with the mental models, you know, the best way I've found is really to show the kind of time savings you make overall by investing more time up front. Because the story with Toyota in particular, you know, that was the one that caught people's attention in the mid-80s. Well, it's documented through several papers. It certainly had a big impact in the States. They went ahead and they developed a simplified version of the QFD to suit the intellectual capacity of their supply base. They perceived that the original Japanese technique would be too complex for them, so we're going to make it simple. And therein lay some of the problems, actually, because they ran into difficulties with, they've cut too many corners here. You know, they've tried to get to the answer quicker. And there is a general problem, you know, with management thinking. You know, minimize the resource at the front end. What the Japanese tend to do is, no, that's where you put the resource in. And then you put less resource in when it's really expensive down the back end. So I've been trying to do that. I've got quite a lot of success. Well, got success with Mike. He's one of the senior guys at ETI in responding to that kind of message. You know, because in reality it was a great example of somebody who took it on board. Yeah, makes sense. And then, you know, gave me the opportunity really to work with him, with groups of stakeholders and project teams. And then you start seeing that actually it's saving time downstream. So the first, I was very fortunate. I had to do this approach on a European collaboration project that was recruited to Lucas to work on. That was automated, flexible automation for aerospace composite structures. And we decided we were going to apply all we learnt about the Japanese, how they go about programs. So I came in, you know, wet behind the ears. Been working in the MOD, R&D, down at Farnborough, and didn't know diddly really about program management, but I had a great plan that showed me, oh, you've got to go and do something called a KFD now, Kim. So I'd ask the team, you know, who knows how to do this? Then we go and do it. What struck me was at the end of the 3 years, the project had worked. People who came in to see what we developed were amazed, and we came in significantly under budget. In fact, we were trying to spend money at the end to make it look as though we hadn't overestimated significantly. And I put a lot of that down to some of these techniques to flush out what's really important in this manufacturing cell that we're producing. You know, where are the critical design pieces? Despite my naivety and my relative inexperience, you know, very, very successful program. To the point where the European Commission said to us, well, we haven't seen one like this before, because it works. Yeah. Like,
Stop now, you can have
yeah,
three,
yeah,
take a few questions.
yeah.